Silas Crowley grabbed the iron Mustang off the shelf and hurled it into the dirt right in front of the whole town. "This is what you traded your mother's home for," he said. "Scrap." Abby Mercer did not flinch. She walked forward, lifted it from the dust with her bleeding hand, and looked him dead in the eye. "Touch my work again," she said quietly, "and I will make certain every man in this county knows exactly how you stole it from me." They had laughed at her for collecting rusted horseshoes. They had no idea what she had already built inside that barn. If that sent a chill down your spine, subscribe, follow Abby's story to the very end, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. The morning they laughed at Abigail Mercer was the morning she decided she was done apologizing for existing. It started the way most cruelties do in a small Kansas town, casually, almost cheerfully, the way men laugh when they believe no one important is watching. Abby had pulled her mule cart to the side of the road outside Franklin Webb's blacksmith shop just after sunrise, when the summer heat already had its hands around the throat of Red Willow and squeezed. She wore her faded pale blue dress, her worn beige apron, and the determination of a woman who had learned that the world would not pause its cruelty simply because she was grieving. She had come for the discards. The broken horseshoes Webb left in the pile behind the water trough. The cracked wagon brackets stacked against the fence post. The bent rail iron that had rolled off a flatbed 3 weeks ago and nobody had bothered to retrieve. To Webb it was garbage. To Abby it was raw material. She knew the difference between iron that was ruined and iron that was merely misread. She had been loading quietly for 10 minutes when the cowboys started in on her. There were 4 of them leaning against the rail in front of the saloon across the street. Young men, or young enough to still believe that humiliating a woman was a form of entertainment rather than a confession of character. The loudest one, a lanky ranch hand with a sunburned neck and a smirk that had probably never cost him anything, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hey, sweetheart," he drew the word out long and mocking. "You planning to build yourself a husband out of all that scrap? 'Cause I guarantee you, no living cowboy in this county's gonna want you otherwise." The laughter came immediately, the fast, relieved laughter of men who'd been waiting for someone to say what they'd all been thinking. Abby kept loading. Her hands did not shake. Her pace did not change. She lifted a broken wheel bracket and placed it carefully in the cart, the way her father had taught her, back straight, knees bent. Let the legs carry the weight. The lanky one was not finished. Maybe she's collecting enough iron to weigh herself down so she don't float away in the next flood. Another burst of laughter. Someone stamped a boot against the boardwalk. "That's a lot of anchor you'd be needing, darling." Abby turned her face slightly away from them. Not because she was ashamed, because she did not want them to see the red climbing up her throat. She was 27 years old. She had buried her father in the mud of a February morning 16 months ago, held her mother's shaking hands over the grave, and ridden back to a ranch that owed more money than it had earned in 3 years. She had not slept a full night since. She had sold 8 of her father's best cattle-mended fence line in the dark and eaten cold biscuits standing over the kitchen basin because there was no time to sit. She was not going to cry over a lanky fool with a sunburned neck, but it still burned. Every time it still burned. She reached for the last broken horseshoe in the pile, a large one cracked cleanly through the heel, and at that moment one of the other cowboys grabbed it off the post where it had been balancing and threw it deliberately into the dust at her feet. "Fetch," he said. The men howled. Abby looked down at the horseshoe in the dirt. Then she looked up. Not at the cowboys. She looked across the street past the saloon to where Caleb Hart was standing in front of the general store with a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and his hat in his hand. Caleb Hart was 36 years old, owned the most successful modest cattle operation in the county, and was known by every person in Red Willow as a fair and principled man. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches of broad-shouldered, weathered patience. He had dark brown hair and deep-set eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain. He was not a cruel man. He had never once in Abby's memory thrown a horseshoe at anyone's feet. He was also not saying a word. He stood there with his hat in his hand, watching, and said nothing at all. Abby held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Long enough to let him know she had seen him. Long enough to let him understand that silence in this moment was its own kind of answer. Then she bent down, picked up the horseshoe, and placed it in the cart with the rest. It was at that precise moment that Silas Crowley appeared. He came out of the general store's side door with the unhurried step of a man who had never needed to rush because money moved slower than the people it controlled. Silas Crowley was 51 years old, stout through the middle, and wore his prosperity the way a rooster wore its feathers, loudly, and with constant expectation of acknowledgement. He was the primary creditor on the Mercer property note. He was also, though Abby had not yet confirmed this, the reason the note had been refinanced at terms her father had not fully understood. He stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her cart. Then he looked at her. Then, loud enough for the entire street to hear, he said, "Collect every broken shoe in Kansas if you like, Miss Mercer. Rust does not pay a mortgage." The cowboys went quieter. This was different. This wasn't entertainment. This was business, and business in Red Willow moved through Crowley the way water moved through a sluice gate. Crowley stepped off the boardwalk into the street, which meant he wanted to be closer than the distance required. He wanted her to feel the proximity. The county foreclosure auction on the Mercer property is scheduled for 30 days from this Thursday, he said pleasantly enough. $420, Miss Mercer. That is the figure. I would hate to watch your mother lose the home she built. Abby's hand was still on the side of the cart. She could feel the rough grain of the wood beneath her palm. She was gripping the horseshoe she had just retrieved from the dirt, its jagged, cracked edge pressing into her hand, and she squeezed it, and she held it, and she did not look away from Crowley's small, satisfied eyes. "Then you had better pray it remains rust, Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice came out even, steady. She had not planned the words, they arrived fully formed from somewhere in her chest, somewhere near where she kept the things she didn't allow herself to say in public. Crowley blinked once. Then he smiled. "Good day, Miss Mercer." He turned and walked back toward the bank. Abby placed the last piece of iron in the cart, picked up the reins, clicked her tongue at the mule, and drove away from Franklin Webb's blacksmith shop without looking at the cowboys again. She did not look at Caleb Hart. She did not look at anyone. It was only after she had turned onto the road that ran south out of town, with the dust rising behind the cart wheels and the summer heat pressing down on her shoulders like a hand trying to push her into the ground, that she looked at her right palm and saw the blood. The cracked edge of the horseshoe had cut through the leather of her glove. A thin, dark line ran from the base of her thumb toward her wrist. She stared at it for a moment, and then she closed her hand and she kept driving. Chape. The Mercer Ranch sat 160 acres outside Red Willow, and it was suffering the way things suffer when they have been quietly failing for long enough that the failure begins to look like character. The north fence line sagged between posts that had rotted through at the base. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary had dropped 2 feet over the summer and would likely drop further before September arrived. The cattle were down to 14 head. She'd sold the others in the spring, at prices that still made her stomach turn when she calculated them. Her father, Silas Mercer, had loved this land with the stubborn, uncomplicated love of a man who had built something with his hands. He'd bought the acreage 15 years ago, when it was nothing but grass and one good well, and he'd spent a decade turning it into something that fed them and clothed them, and allowed him to look at his wife and daughter with the particular pride of a man who had kept his promises. He was not a wealthy man. He had never pretended to be. He was a rancher and a part-time blacksmith, and he had the kind of iron patience that made him extraordinary at both. He had died of pneumonia on a Tuesday in February 16 months ago. The medical bills and the 2 failed cattle seasons and the terms of a refinancing agreement that a dying man had signed without understanding the penalty clauses had combined to produce a debt of $420 owed to Silas Crowley's private lending office. Abby had read the agreement 3 times. The interest terms changed in the second year at a rate her father had not calculated. She believed he had been shown different numbers than the ones he signed. She had no way to prove it without documents Crowley would never willingly produce. Martha Mercer, 54 years old, was sitting on the porch steps when Abby drove the mule cart into the yard. Her mother had been beautiful once, was still beautiful, Abby thought, in the way of women who have loved people deeply and lost them and kept going anyway. There was a quiet in Martha's face that had arrived with grief and decided to stay. She stood when she saw the cart and came to meet her daughter. "You're bleeding," Martha said immediately. "I know." Abby climbed down from the cart. "It's not deep." Martha took her daughter's hand without asking and peeled back the glove. She looked at the cut. Then she looked at the cart full of broken iron. "They laughed at you," Martha said. It was not a question. "They always laugh." Abby moved past her toward the house. "I brought enough iron for what I need. We have coal left from last winter." "Abby." Martha followed. "Abby, we have 30 days. 29. She stopped at the door and turned around. "And I know what I'm doing, Mama. I just need you to trust me." Martha studied her daughter's face for a long moment. Abby had her father's jaw, the straight-set jaw that did not move when the mind was made up. Martha had loved that jaw on Silas. She had argued with it and been comforted by it and watched it go still and white in a hospital bed. She was not entirely sure how she felt about seeing it on her daughter. "Come eat something," Martha said finally. "The iron will still be there after supper." Abby waited until her mother was asleep. She had learned to wait in the way that people who carry secret things inside them learn to wait with patience, with apparent stillness, with the absolute knowledge that the moment will arrive. The house went quiet around 10 o'clock. She sat in the kitchen for another half hour, listening to her mother's breathing, and then she put on her father's leather blacksmith apron. It was too large for her. It had always been too large. She had been wearing it for 3 years, since the first time her father let her work the forge without supervision, and the straps crossed awkwardly around her shoulders, and the bottom edge hit her at the thigh instead of the knee. She wore it anyway. She wore it because it smelled like iron and coal smoke, and the particular kind of focused silence her father carried into the barn with him every time he worked. She lit the coal forge. She had built the fire in her father's forge 237 times. She knew exactly how to bank the coals to get the heat she needed, how to work the bellows in intervals rather than continuously, how to read the color of glowing iron, the way a doctor reads a pulse. Yellow-white was too hot, it would make the metal brittle. Orange-red was working heat. Deep red meant slow down. She placed the cracked horseshoe into the fire. She had not decided this consciously exactly. She had decided it the way a person decides to breathe because the body already knows and the mind simply catches up. She watched the iron heat. She thought about the shape she wanted. She had been carrying the shape in her head for 3 years, since the morning she had watched her father repair a ranch gate, and the light had struck the iron a certain way, and she had thought it could move. If you worked it right, iron could look like it was in motion. When the shoe reached orange, she pulled it to the anvil. The first strike rang out into the dark barn, and Abby felt the reverberation move up through her arm and into her shoulder and into her chest the way it always did. Like a second heartbeat, like the barn itself was answering. She was working the iron into a running Mustang. Not because she had a plan yet, not a full one, but because the shape was right. A Mustang running with its legs stretched and its mane lifting and its chest forward into whatever was coming at it. She wanted it small enough to hold in one hand. She wanted it to look like it was going somewhere and refusing to stop. The first attempt was crude. The neck came out too thick, and when she tried to define the jaw, the proportion pulled wrong and one ear broke off entirely when she moved too fast through the shoulder joint. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment, the failed shape cooling on the anvil, and she felt the familiar pull of despair that lived in the back of every attempt. She picked up the piece and held it over the forge. Her father's voice arrived the way it always did, not as a sound, but as a presence. The way certain voices become so much a part of a person that they don't need ears to be heard. Iron never becomes useful by pretending it was never broken. She had been 10 years old when he said it. She had ruined a set of hinges and was on the verge of throwing them into the scrap pile, and he had picked them up, turned them over in his hands, and said those words without looking at her. Then he had reheated them and shown her how to salvage the work. She reheated the piece and began again. She heard the boots at the barn door around 11:30. She had been working for an hour and a half. The second attempt was better. The legs were proportioned. The running position was reading clearly. She needed another 30 minutes on the head. Miss Mercer. She did not turn from the anvil. Mr. Hart. Caleb Hart stepped into the barn. He was still wearing his trail clothes, dark vest, rolled sleeves, worn boots, but he had taken off his hat, which meant he wasn't planning to be here for business. People kept their hats on in Kansas for business. Your mother loaned my men a wrench 2 weeks back, he said. Wanted to return it. You could have left it on the fence post. Could have. He stopped a few feet inside the door and looked at the forge, at the anvil, at the iron in her hands. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he expected to dismiss and found instead that he couldn't. I didn't know you worked iron. Most people don't. She set down the piece and turned to face him. Something else you want to say? He held the wrench in both hands and turned it over once. I want to say I should have silenced my men today outside Webb's shop. He was not a man who found apology easy. She could hear it in the way he shaped the sentence, careful and deliberate, the way a person is careful with something they know can break. I didn't, and that was a failure of character on my part. Abby looked at him. In the firelight from the forge, he was all shadow and amber, and she couldn't entirely read his expression, which was probably just as well. You were quiet when they laughed, she said. Quiet can stand beside cruelty just as easily as words, Mr. Hart. He took that. He didn't push back against it, didn't qualify, it didn't offer an explanation she hadn't asked for. He simply took it and stood with it. That's true, he said. Abby turned back to the anvil. Your hand is injured, he said from behind her. My hand is working. I can see that. A pause. You've got a wagon rim leaning against the south wall there. That's a two-person lift if you're going to move it safely. I didn't ask for your help, Mr. Hart. No, ma'am, you didn't. Another pause. Offer stands if you want it. She struck the iron once, twice, 3 times. The sound filled the barn and came back off the rafters. Then she said without turning around, Leave the wrench on the shelf by the door. She heard him cross the floor. She heard the quiet weight of the wrench placed on the shelf. She heard him stop again at the door. That Mustang you're working, he said. The way the legs are set, it looks like it's running toward something, not away. Abby's hammer paused over the anvil. It is, she said. Good, said Caleb Hart. And then his boots were gone from the barn floor, and she was alone with the fire and the iron, and 30 days she had no intention of wasting. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally set down the hammer, she had 4 finished pieces lined up on the shelf above the water barrel. A running Mustang the size of her palm. A barn owl with wings half opened, as if caught between landing and flight. A leaping jackrabbit with one ear bent from an early attempt she had salvaged into a detail, and a rearing horse smaller than her fist, every muscle suggested in the curve of the iron. She looked at them for a long time. They were good. Not perfect. She could see the flaws in each one, the places where she had worked slightly too fast or pulled the metal in a direction it had resisted, but they were good. They were genuinely, unmistakably good, and she knew it, and she also knew that knowing it and proving it were different countries with a wide river between them. $420. 29 days. She looked at the center of the barn floor. The dirt was packed and bare and wide. She had measured it once as a child, standing in the middle with her arms stretched wide and spinning slowly. She remembered the feeling of the space opening around her. She picked up a nail from the workbench and walked to the center of the floor. She crouched down and drew a shape in the dirt. It took her 4 minutes and 3 attempts to get the proportions right. When she was finished, she stood and looked down at what she had drawn. A rearing Mustang, life-sized, perhaps 9 feet at the raised forelegs. Every curve of the chest and neck and the lifted head that she had been carrying in her imagination for 3 years without knowing she was going to need it. She could use rail iron for the spine, wagon rims for the ribs, plow blades for the chest, horseshoes, hundreds of broken horseshoes for the outer coat. She looked at her 4 small sculptures on the shelf. Then she looked at the dirt drawing. Then she put the nail in her apron pocket and went to the door and looked out at the dark yard and the summer sky, which was cloudless and ridiculous with stars, and she thought Crowley wants $420. But Margaret Holloway at the Railroad Hotel has been looking for something to put outside her front entrance for 2 years. And there are railroad buyers coming for Founders Day. And the thing that has real value is the thing nobody expected you to make. She went back inside, moved to the shelf, and looked at her 4 animals again. She was still looking at them when her mother appeared in the barn doorway in her house robe, hair loose, holding a lantern. Martha said nothing for a moment. She lifted the lantern and moved it slowly along the shelf, the light passing over each piece in turn. "Abby," she said quietly, "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "You're going to say that Crowley will accept money, not hope." Martha was quiet. The lantern moved to the Mustang, the one Abby had made from the horseshoe they had thrown in the dirt, and her mother held the light steady on it for a long time. "Then I will build something large enough to make hope worth money," Abby said. Martha looked at her daughter. Then she looked at the shape drawn in the dirt floor. "Your father would have asked you how you planned to move a 9-foot iron Mustang safely when you've only got one working hand and a mule," Martha said. "Papa would have also already started cutting rail sections," Abby said. The corner of her mother's mouth moved. Just slightly. Just enough. "He would have," Martha agreed. "He absolutely would have." She turned and walked back toward the house. At the doorway she stopped. "There's biscuits left from supper," she said without looking back. "Eat something before you fall over." Abby looked at the dirt-drawn Mustang in the floor of her father's barn. She picked up the hammer. She was not falling over. She had work to do. The morning after she drew the Mustang in the dirt, Abby woke up before the rooster did. Her right hand had stiffened overnight. The cut across her palm had closed, but pulled tight whenever she flexed her fingers, and the first thing she did when she got out of bed was close her fist 3 times, testing it, deciding whether it was going to cooperate. It cooperated. Good enough. She had a plan now, and a plan was more dangerous than hope, because a plan required execution. She wrapped her hand, put on her father's apron, and went back to the barn. The 4 iron animals were still on the shelf where she'd left them. The Mustang drawing was still in the dirt floor. She stood over it for exactly 30 seconds, committing the proportions to memory, and then she picked up the nail from her pocket and adjusted the curve of the hindquarters 2 inches to the left. Better. The weight distribution would be more stable that way. She had 29 days. She needed iron. She needed coal. She needed, though she hadn't fully admitted this yet, money before the money seed capital to buy materials before the finished sculpture could produce any return. The 4 small animals on the shelf represented her only negotiable asset, and she intended to spend them carefully. She wrapped the running Mustang in a piece of clean cloth, tucked it under her arm, and hitched the mule. It was time to find out what her work was actually worth. The general store in Red Willow opened at 7, and Abby was there at 7:02, which meant she'd had to push the mule harder than she liked on the South Road. She didn't mind. The mule minded, but the mule would survive. Gerald Putnam ran the general store, and he was the kind of man who had strong opinions about everything except the things that required courage to have opinions about. He was arranging tobacco tins when Abby came through the door, and he looked up with the particular expression of a man who has already decided the conversation is going to waste his time. "Miss Mercer." He set down a tin. "What can I do for you?" It was not a question. It was a sentence with the question removed from it. Abby unwrapped the iron Mustang and set it on the counter. Putnam looked at it. He picked it up. He turned it over, which told her he was looking at the joint work on the underside, the way the legs connected to the body. She had done that work carefully, and she knew it would hold up to inspection. He set it back down. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he said. "Buy it," Abby said. "Or trade for it. I need blacksmithing coal. 20 pounds would do." Putnam looked at the Mustang again, then at Abby, then back at the Mustang. A woman had come in behind Abby and was pretending to look at bolts of fabric while listening to every word. "It's a fine piece of ironwork," Putnam said carefully, which meant he thought it was better than fine and didn't want to say so because that would affect the negotiation. "But I don't have much call for iron animals. This isn't an art gallery." 20 pounds of coal, Abby said. "Or $2 cash." The woman at the fabric bolts turned around. She was Mrs. Hensley, wife of one of the cattle buyers, and her face had the particular expression of someone who has just witnessed something unexpected and hasn't decided yet how to categorize it. "That's a lot to ask for scrap," Putnam said. "It's not scrap," Abby said. "It's original iron sculpture made from material your customers threw away. If you don't want it, Mr. Putnam, say so directly, and I'll take it elsewhere." Putnam opened his mouth. "I'll purchase it." The voice came from behind her, and Abby turned. Dr. Walter Bell was standing just inside the doorway. He was 62 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades carrying other people's suffering and hadn't buckled yet, and he was looking at the Mustang on the counter with an expression of quiet, genuine interest. He walked to the counter and picked up the Mustang. He turned it the way Putnam had turned it, but slower, with more attention. He looked at the legs. He looked at the neck, where Abby had done something subtle with the angle that suggested the animal was leaning into wind. He looked at the eye sockets, which she had left hollow and which caught whatever light was in the room and made the piece seem somehow alert. $2, he said. "Dr. Bell, you don't have to," Abby started. "I'm not doing anything I don't intend to do, Miss Mercer." He reached into his coat pocket and produced 2 silver dollars. He set them on the counter. Then he turned to Putnam. "Give her a receipt, Gerald, written, stating that this piece was purchased for $2 from Miss Abigail Mercer, original iron sculptor." Putnam blinked. "Walter, that's not exactly necessary." "Write the receipt," Dr. Bell said pleasantly. "Original iron sculptor, her full name." Putnam wrote the receipt. Abby folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She held the 2 silver dollars and looked at Dr. Bell and tried to find the right words and couldn't, so she just said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I bought a piece of art. That's a transaction, not a favor." He picked up his hat. "You have more work like this." "I will have," Abby said. He nodded as if this was exactly what he expected her to say. "Then I'd suggest you take that receipt to every buyer you approach from this point forward. Let them see someone already paid a fair price. It changes the conversation." He walked out. Abby looked at the 2 silver dollars in her palm. Then she looked at Putnam, who had the expression of a man who had just realized he'd made a miscalculation. 20 pounds of coal, she said. Cash. He sold it to her. She drove home faster than she should have, and she didn't care. $2 was not 420. She understood that with complete clarity. But $2 was proof. It was documented proof in a written receipt with her name on it that her work had value that another person had voluntarily recognized and paid for. That was different from skill. Skill was private. Proof was public. She spent the rest of the day at the forge. The barn owl came out better than the Mustang. Had the wingspan was cleaner, and she managed a detail on the feathers by using a narrow chisel after the iron cooled slightly, which created texture she hadn't achieved before. The jackrabbit needed another hour of work on the haunches. She finished it past midnight and set it beside the owl and stood back and looked at both of them in the forge light. Good. Better than good. But small pieces would not save the ranch. She had done the arithmetic twice now, and it said the same thing both times at $2 per sculpture. Working every night, she could produce perhaps 40 pieces before the auction. $80. Against 420. She needed something large enough to change the arithmetic entirely. She needed the Mustang. She picked up the nail and crouched over the dirt drawing again, and she started thinking about iron. Real iron. Rail iron, the heavy structural material that could carry 9 feet of finished sculpture without bending. Rail iron was not in Webb's scrap pile. Rail iron was at the abandoned mining camp 7 miles east of town, where a failed silver operation had left equipment behind when the company dissolved 3 years ago. She had never been there alone. She went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark calculating weight distributions until she fell asleep. She was loading the wagon at 6 the next morning when Caleb Hart rode into the yard. She didn't hear him coming because the wind was wrong, and she was concentrating on the tie-down knots. So when she turned around, and he was simply there, sitting his horse at the fence line with his hat on and his expression carefully neutral. Her first reaction was irritation, which she recognized as an ungenerous response to a man who had apologized sincerely 2 nights ago. She held on to the irritation anyway, because it was a useful emotion when dealing with men who appeared without invitation. "Mr. Hart," she said. "Miss Mercer." He didn't dismount. "You're heading out early." "I'm heading east. The old mining camp." Something shifted in his expression. That road washed out in the spring flood. The dry wash on the lower section, your wagon wheels'll sink if you go through it at the wrong angle. Abby looked at him. "I'll manage. You might." He did dismount, then loosely, the way men who spend most of their lives on horses dismount without thinking about it. He tied the horse to the fence post and walked toward her. "Or I could follow along in case you don't." "That's not the same as being invited," she said. "No, ma'am, it's not." He stopped. "I've got 3 ranch hands checking the north pasture this morning and nothing that requires me specifically until noon. I could be in the general vicinity of the east road in case a wagon needed assistance." Abby looked at him for a long moment. He was not offering to take over. He was not positioning himself as her rescuer. He was telling her he would be in the vicinity, which was technically her choice to interpret however she wanted. "You'll follow my instructions," she said. "If we get to the camp and I tell you how I want the rail sections loaded, you load them that way. Not how you think is more efficient. My way. Understood? And you don't get to ask me questions about why I'm building what I'm building. Not yet." "That seems reasonable?" "All right." She turned back to the wagon. "Don't fall behind on the east road. The mule sets a faster pace than most people expect." The mule did not set a particularly fast pace, and they both knew it, but Caleb rode at a respectful distance behind the wagon and didn't comment on the speed or the road or anything else until they reached the dry wash where the wagon lurched hard left and the front wheel dropped 6 inches into loose sand before Abby had time to compensate. She had the reins tight and was already calculating the angle she needed to correct when Caleb appeared at the wagon's left side without being asked. His horse braced against the pull and said, "Right rein steady, don't yank it." "I know," she said, and didn't yank it. The wagon came up. She got the front wheel onto the harder soil. They moved through. Neither of them said anything about it. At the mining camp, they found Josiah Reed. Abby had not known he would be there. She had heard about him, a retired railroad construction worker, 67 years old, who had been injured in a rail-laying accident 5 years ago and walked with a permanent damage to his left leg that he managed with a carved walking stick and impressive stubbornness. He lived in a converted storage shack near the abandoned camp because the rent was nothing and the solitude suited him. He came to the door of the shack when he heard the wagon and stood on the threshold with his stick planted and his eyes moving between Abby and Caleb and the wagon and back to Abby again. "You here for iron," he said. It was not a question. "Rail sections," Abby said. "The thick structural grade, not the surface material. I need pieces that can carry weight vertically." Josiah looked at her for a moment. "What are you building?" "A 9-foot iron Mustang." A pause. "Standing on its hind legs," she added. Josiah was quiet for long enough that Caleb shifted in his saddle. Then Josiah said, "Come here." He led her to the main rail storage, which was a collapsed lean-to on the north side of the camp. He pointed to a stack of thick rail sections and told her to pick them up. She picked up the nearest one. He watched the way she handled it, how she assessed the weight, before committing how she adjusted her grip when she felt the balance point shift. "Now that one," he said, pointing to a section 3 feet to the right. She reached for it, ran her hand along the length, stopped near the center. "This one's cracked." Josiah's eyebrows moved. "Where?" She showed him. The crack was internal, barely visible on the surface, but she could feel the slight give in the metal under pressure. A structural use would fail within a year. Josiah looked at the crack. He looked at her. He looked at Caleb. "She's right," he said to Caleb, as if Caleb had expressed doubt, which he hadn't. "I know," Caleb said. Josiah turned back to Abby. "I'll give you 12 usable sections, on one condition. Name it. You brace every vertical load point before you weld it, and you never work beneath an unsecured section alone. If it shifts, it'll come down faster than you can get clear, and a woman your size cannot roll out from under rail iron." The last part was stated flatly without cruelty. It was an engineering fact, not an insult. Abby recognized the difference. Agreed, she said. Josiah nodded once. You know how to use a block and tackle lift. My father taught me. Then let's load your wagon. It took 2 hours to load the sections properly, and by the time they finished, Caleb had removed his vest and was working in his shirt sleeves in the midday heat, moving iron where Abby directed and not once suggesting a different approach. Josiah supervised the placement from his position near the wagon, his walking stick planted, giving Abby corrections on the stacking angle with the specificity of a man who had spent 30 years not allowing sloppy work on structures that carried human weight. At one point, Caleb misread the direction Abby indicated for a particularly long section and began to position it at the wrong angle. Other way, Abby said. He reversed it without comment. Josiah caught Abby's eye and gave a very small nod, as if to say that one's trainable. On the drive back, Caleb, riding alongside this time, rather than behind the conversation that happened, was the kind that starts practical and arrives somewhere neither person entirely planned. How long have you been working iron? Caleb asked. Since I was 11. Seriously, since I was 14. Your father teach you? Everything I know. She kept her eyes on the road. He said I had the hands for it. Patience in the fingers, he used to say. You can teach technique, but you can't teach patience. He was right, Caleb said. About the patience part. I watched you at the forge 2 nights ago. Most men I know work iron angry. You work it like you're listening to it. Abby was quiet for a moment. You have to listen to it. Iron tells you what it can do and what it can't. You try to force it past what it can do, it'll break. Every time. Caleb turned that over. That's true of most things. Most things, she agreed. A pause. Why do you hide that you can do this? He asked. The question landed plainly without judgment, and she almost didn't answer it, and then she did, because the road was long, and the answer was one she was tired of carrying alone. Because when a woman shows skill in this territory, one of 2 things happens, she said. Either men decide she's remarkable and make her into a curiosity to discuss, or they decide she's threatening and find reasons to doubt the work. Either way, the work stops being the point. Caleb was quiet. My father sold my repairs as his own for 3 years, she said. Not to deceive me, to protect the work, so it would be judged on its quality instead of on who made it. She paused. I hated it, and I understood it at the same time, which is its own kind of exhausting. That shouldn't be the choice, Caleb said. No, Abby said. It shouldn't. They rode in silence for a while, and it was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. What you said to me the other night, Caleb said finally, about quiet standing beside cruelty. I meant it. I know you did. He paused. I've been thinking about it since. About how many times I've been quiet in rooms where I should have spoken. It's a convenient habit when you're the one the cruelty isn't aimed at. Abby glanced at him sideways. Most people don't admit that. Most people don't have someone say it to their face plainly enough to make them think about it. She looked back at the road. Something in her chest shifted, not dramatically, not the way stories describe these moments. Just a small, quiet shift, like a joint settling into a position that had slightly more room than the one before. She didn't say anything else about it, but she didn't move away from it either. The Mustang frame went up over the following week, and it was nothing like she had imagined it would be. She had imagined it clearly and correctly, as it turned out the sequence of assembly, the placement of the rail spine, the way the wagon rim ribs would curve out from the central structure to define the chest cavity. What she had not imagined was how it would feel to watch it rise. The first time she stood the spine section vertical, and Josiah, who came to help on the 3rd day, and every day after making the 7-mile trip on a borrowed horse, because he said the project was the most interesting thing he'd seen in 5 years, held it plumb, while she welded the base plates. She stepped back and looked at the raw structural skeleton of what was going to be a Mustang, and felt something open in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. Progress, not hope. Something more solid than hope. Caleb came in the evenings after his ranch work was done. He never arrived with an agenda. He arrived with his sleeves already rolled and asked what needed doing, and she told him, and he did it. He learned quickly that hand me the flat chisel meant the flat chisel and not whatever he thought might work equally well. She told him once. He did not require a second correction. On the fifth evening, while she was fitting a curved section of wagon rim into position on the right shoulder of the frame, he said, "My brother left me this ranch when he died, 4 years ago." She had not known he had a brother. She kept working the fit, but she was listening. How was 41? Fever took him in August, which felt wrong because August is supposed to be the cruelest for old men and children, not 41-year-old ranchers who knew what they were doing. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been running his ranch and mine since. 12 ranch hands who depended on him and then had to decide whether to depend on me instead." "Did they?" she asked. "Most of them. 2 left. Can't say I blame them. I wasn't him." He paused. "I've spent 4 years trying to run something the way someone else built it. Wondering whether I should build it differently, whether it's mine or whether I'm just keeping it warm." Abby set down the rim section. She looked at him. "It's yours," she said. "Whatever you build from it is yours. Inheritance isn't a blueprint. It's starting capital." Caleb looked at her. "Your father's apron is mine," she said, "and what I make in it is mine." He nodded slowly, as if something had settled for him too. "I'm tired of kindness that expects gratitude as payment," she said then, because the conversation had opened enough space for it. "Every time someone helps me and then waits for me to be appropriately appreciative in the right way for the right amount of time, like the help was a loan that didn't come with stated terms." "I'm not keeping a ledger," Caleb said. "I know," she said, and she meant it. She had been watching for it carefully, the way you watch for a flaw in iron you're about to trust with weight, and she hadn't found it. He handed her the rim section before she asked for it angled exactly right. She welded it into place. The Owl sold on a Thursday. She took it to the hardware store where a rancher from 2 counties over was purchasing wire, and he saw it on the counter where she'd set it while she waited for Putnam to finish with another customer. The rancher turned it over in his hands the way Dr. Bell had turned the Mustang, with genuine attention rather than performance. "This for sale?" he asked. $250, Abby said. He paid without negotiating. She was back in the wagon before she let herself react, and even then, she kept it quiet. One long breath, hands flat on her thighs. The kind of release you allow yourself when you're alone, and the thing you've been holding has finally shifted. $250. With the $2 from Dr. Bell, she had $450, against $420. She laughed. Once short, almost involuntary. $450 against $420, and she had a 9-foot structural iron skeleton standing in her barn that wasn't finished yet and had no coat and no head and no face, and Founder's Day was 23 days away. She picked up the reins. She still had the jackrabbit piece, the small rearing horse, and she had started a 4th piece, a running wolf that was turning into something better than anything she'd done before. She could sell the remaining pieces to fund materials. She could finish the Mustang. She could get it into the exhibition. She had a plan and momentum and $4.50. What she did not have, she discovered when she drove into the ranch yard and found Silas Crowley standing beside her barn with 3 of his men. Was time to celebrate. Crowley turned when he heard the wagon. He was dressed in his business clothes, which meant he wanted her to feel the formality of his presence as a kind of authority. He had a piece of paper in his hand. "Miss Mercer." He let her climb down from the wagon. He was patient when he wanted to be, and patience from Silas Crowley was always more frightening than his irritation. "I've been making inquiries about the Mercer property, in anticipation of the foreclosure proceeding." "The auction is in 23 days, Abby said. "I have 23 days. You do." Crowley looked at the barn. "I understand you have some project underway in your father's barn. Blacksmithing work of some kind." He paused. "I've also heard you've been collecting rail iron from the abandoned camp, substantial structural material." Abby said nothing. "I want to be transparent with you," Crowley said, in the tone of a man who had never been transparent about anything in his professional life. There is a proposed railroad spur that may cross the northeastern corner of this property. I have been approached by parties interested in this land for that reason. If the auction proceeds as scheduled, I expect the bidding to be competitive. I wanted her to know that he wanted the land badly. He wanted her to know that she couldn't fight it. He wanted her to feel the weight of that certainty and fold under it. "Thank you for being transparent," Abby said. Crowley smiled. He turned to leave. Then he stopped as if a thought had just occurred to him, which meant it had occurred to him before he arrived. "I hear you've been selling small iron pieces, little animals." He paused. "Charming. Of course the auction price will not be reduced by," he considered, $4.50. He walked out of the yard. Abby stood very still until his wagon was out of sight. Then she turned to the barn. Then she turned back to the road where he'd gone. He knew the exact amount she had earned. Somebody in town was reporting to him. She thought about Dr. Bell writing the receipt. She thought about the rancher in the hardware store. She thought about who had been in both places and might have found it worth mentioning to Crowley's people. She didn't know yet, but she filed it. She went into the barn and stood in front of the skeleton of the Mustang and looked at the empty space where the head would go, and she thought, he wants this land because a railroad is coming through it. Which means this land is worth more than $420. Which means Crowley has been hiding that information while collecting on a debt that was inflated by terms her father didn't understand. Which meant this was not just a mortgage. This was theft conducted slowly through paperwork, which was the most common kind. She picked up the hammer. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, she noted with some distant part of her mind. From anger. Clean, useful, focused anger, the kind that doesn't scatter, but collects itself into the work. She struck the iron. The sound rang out across the empty yard through the summer evening past the road where Crowley's wagon had gone. She struck it again. And then she stopped, because she heard something she had not expected to hear, movement outside the barn, near the wagon she'd left hitched by the door. She set down the hammer and went to look. One of the forged joining plates, heavy iron brackets she had made to link the Mustang's internal frame sections, was gone from the wagon bed. She had loaded 4 of them in Red Willow that morning. There were 3 left. She looked at the yard. She looked at the road. She looked at the tracks in the dust near the wagon's left wheel. The tracks weren't hers. The boot was narrower, the heel deeper, the stride shorter. Someone had been in her yard while she was in the barn. Someone had taken the joining plate. She stood in the yard in the early evening, holding the hammer she'd carried out from the barn, and she looked at those tracks, and she understood that the laughter, the mocking, the cruelty, the public humiliation had been the easy part. What was coming now was something different. They weren't laughing at her anymore. They were afraid of what she was building. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid exactly. Fear was a thing she had learned to work alongside the way you work alongside a difficult animal, acknowledging it, not letting it set the pace. What kept her awake was the calculation. Someone had taken 1 joining plate. 1. Not all 4, not the tools, not the coal. 1 plate, which meant whoever took it wanted her to notice the absence and understand the message without having anything concrete to report to Sheriff Doyle. This was not random theft. This was communication. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and thought about Crowley, knowing her exact earnings down to the $50. She thought about the narrow boot print in the dust by the wagon wheel. She thought about the 3 men who had been standing with Crowley in her yard that afternoon, all of them looking at the barn with the particular blankness of men who have been told to look like they aren't looking at something. By 4 in the morning, she had a short list of names. By 5, she had dismissed half of them for lack of motive or access. By 6, she was at the forge, because the forge was the one place where her mind stopped chasing its own tail and started producing something useful. She made a replacement joining plate before breakfast. It took her 40 minutes, and it came out better than the original. Martha found her eating cold biscuits standing at the workbench, which was where Martha always found her lately, and sat down on the barrel stool without saying anything for a moment. "He knew how much money I had," Abby said. "I heard." Martha folded her hands. "Mrs. Putnam mentioned to me at the well yesterday that Gerald had told someone from Crowley's office about the owl sale." Abby set down the biscuit. "Putnam. He owes Crowley on a business note, has for 2 years. Martha looked at her hands. I should have told you sooner. I thought it was gossip. It's useful, Abby said, and meant it. She picked the biscuit back up. It means I need to do my transactions somewhere Putnam can't hear them. Dr. Bell's office, the hardware store when Putnam's not present. Abby. Martha waited until her daughter looked at her. Someone came onto this property and stole from us. I know. That's not a business problem. That's a threat. I know that too. Abby finished the biscuit and brushed her hands on her apron. But if I go to Doyle with one missing joining plate and boot tracks in the dirt, Crowley's lawyer will call it neighborhood wandering, and I'll spend the next week defending myself instead of building. I need more before I go to the sheriff. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then, your father would have gone to Doyle immediately. Papa would have also lost the ranch in February instead of fighting until August, Abby said gently, but completely. He was a better man than almost anyone I've known. He wasn't always a better strategist. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and said, I'll start keeping a log of anyone who comes onto the property. Time description, what they were doing. Abby looked at her mother. I was married to your father for 29 years, Martha said. I know how to watch and record without being noticed. It's practically a wifely art form. She walked to the barn door and stopped. And Abby, lock the barn at night. Not because I think it'll stop them, because it'll slow them down, and slow is all we need. She was already gone before Abby could respond. Abby turned back to the Mustang. The skeleton was complete. 12 rail sections for the spine and primary leg structure, wagon rim ribs defining the chest and hindquarters, the whole thing standing 8 feet 6 inches at the raised forelegs and anchored to a base plate that Josiah had helped her set 2 days ago. Standing in front of it, she still felt the same thing she'd felt when she first stood, the spine upright, the particular weight of something real that had not existed before she made it exist. Now came the harder work. The skin. She needed horseshoes. Hundreds of them broken and whole to layer across the frame in overlapping scales, the way feathers overlap on a bird's wing. Each shoe had to be individually shaped to its position on the body, heated, curved to the correct angle, and welded to the one beneath it. The outer coat of the Mustang, what would make it look alive rather than structural, was 10 times more labor than the frame itself. She had 67 horseshoes. She needed closer to 400. Whole. Caleb arrived that evening with the first contribution she hadn't asked for. He rode in with 2 barrels strapped to his pack horse, and when Abby came out of the barn, he lifted the lids so she could see. Both barrels were packed with horseshoes, broken ones, worn ones, a few that were merely bent out of true. She stood at the first barrel and lifted a handful and turned them over, assessing. Good iron. Mix of weights, which was actually useful. The heavier shoes could go on the lower body where the scale needed to carry more visual weight, the lighter ones on the neck and head where she wanted movement. How many, she asked. Between both barrels, maybe 240 shoes. Could be more. I had the men pull everything out of the discard bins behind the stable. Abby set the shoes back carefully. She looked at him. What do you want for them? She asked. He opened his mouth. Don't say nothing, she said. He closed his mouth. A pause. I have a saddle bracket that's cracked through at the main rivet point. Webb says it can't be repaired cleanly. I think he's wrong. Bring tomorrow morning. Yes, ma'am. She reached out and touched the edge of the first barrel. 240 shoes. Against what she needed. She was close enough now that close felt real. Someone took a joining plate from my wagon yesterday, she said. She said it evenly without inflection, because she wanted to watch how he received the information rather than how he responded to her delivery of it. Caleb went very still. How much of the frame is compromised? None. I replaced it this morning, but the plate didn't walk away. She looked at him. Crowley was in my yard 2 hours before it went missing. Caleb's jaw set. It was subtle, a tightening at the hinge, a slight change in how he held his head, but she had been watching his face long enough now to read it. I'll start checking the road when I ride past, he said. That's not. I ride past this road twice a day checking my north fence line. It doesn't require any additional arrangement on my part. He looked at her steadily. I'm not stationing myself here. I'm adjusting the route I'm already taking. She looked at him for a moment. All right. Has anyone else offered to help with the Mustang? No. Would you let them if they did? Abby thought about it. A real answer, not the reflexive one. She thought about what the Mustang needed and what she could produce alone, and what 22 days actually looked like when you counted the hours in working time rather than calendar squares. If they came with terms I controlled, she said. I keep authority over the design. Every contribution gets recorded. I won't accept charity dressed as community spirit. Caleb nodded. I'll mention the project when I'm in town. Just mention it. What people do with that is their business. He left without making it a bigger moment than it was, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. She went back into the barn and looked at 240 horseshoes. She started on the flank section at 9 that night and didn't stop until 2 in the morning, and by the time she set down the hammer, she had 34 shoes welded into position on the lower right hindquarter, and her arm felt like someone had filled it with wet sand. It looked extraordinary. The overlapping shoes caught the forge light and threw it back in fragments, like the Mustang's coat was made of something that had absorbed 100 Kansas sunsets and was slowly releasing them. The rust along the edges of the older shoes created color, deep red-brown against the darker iron gradients. She hadn't planned, and couldn't have planned organic and exact at the same time. She stood back and looked at what 34 horseshoes could do on a frame that was honest about what it was made from. She understood in that moment that this sculpture was going to be something. Not just good, something. She was still standing there when she heard the sound from outside, a soft impact, like something being set down, followed by footsteps moving away quickly. She took the hammer from the workbench and went to the barn door. The yard was dark and empty, but on the ground outside the door, someone had left a canvas sack. She approached it carefully, crouched, and opened the top. Inside were 47 horseshoes, most of them broken, all of them usable. No note, no name. She looked out at the road. Nothing. She brought the sack inside and counted the shoes and added them to the barrel. Then she locked the barn door and stood with her back against it in the dark for a moment, processing the fact that somewhere in Red Willow, someone had walked to her farm in the middle of the night and left iron on her doorstep without asking for recognition. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she went back to work. Webb came 3 days later. Franklin Webb, the Red Willow town, blacksmith, 55 years old, built like a man who had been hitting iron for 4 decades, which he had. He had a face that looked permanently irritated because the muscles had arranged themselves that way from years of squinting into forges, and he had been among the people standing outside his own shop when the cowboys laughed at Abby loading her cart. He had not laughed himself, but he had not stopped it either, and they both knew it. He came to the barn door at mid-morning and stood at the threshold without coming in. Abby was working the Mustang's left shoulder, fitting the shoe scales across the complex curve where the leg met the body. It was one of the harder sections because the angle changed constantly, and each shoe had to be individually adjusted before welding. She did not stop working. Miss Mercer, Webb said. Mr. Webb. A pause. I heard you were short on coal. She was short on coal. She had been managing her supply carefully for a week, keeping her fires hotter for shorter intervals, which was a valid technique but exhausting to sustain. Word travels, she said. I've got 2 sacks I can spare. He shifted his weight. And He stopped. Started again. I've been looking at what you're doing from the road when I ride past. The framework. He paused. It's correct. The weight distribution is correct. Abby's hammer paused for half a second. She continued working. I know. I didn't think it would be. He said it flatly without apology, which was actually more honest than an apology would have been. I want you to know I thought it would fail on the vertical load points. I was wrong. Abby set down the hammer and turned to face him. She looked at him steadily. The coal. Yes. He seemed relieved to have something practical to stand behind. I'll bring it this afternoon, and... He reached into his coat and produced something 3 heavy flat stock bars, the kind used for precision fitting work. Better material than anything in her current supply. I have spare stock I'm not using. It'd go to waste otherwise. I'll record it in the contribution ledger, Abby said. When the sculpture sells, documented contributors receive a proportional share of proceeds above the debt amount. Webb looked slightly surprised. I wasn't asking for— I know you weren't, she said. The record exists for my protection as much as yours. No one gets to claim they gave more than they gave, and no one gets to claim the work belongs to them because they contributed to it. She held his gaze. The work is mine, Mr. Webb. The contributions are recorded. A long pause. That's fair, Webb said. That's more than fair. He looked at the Mustang behind her. May I come in? She stepped aside. Webb walked in and stood in front of the Mustang for a full minute without speaking. He moved around it slowly, looking at the frame joints, the weld points, the overlapping shoe scales on the completed sections. He crouched and looked at the base plate anchoring. When he stood back up, his expression had changed. The permanent irritation was still there, but behind it, something else had arrived, the look of a craftsman recognizing craftsmanship. The main, he said. How are you doing the main? Separated steel cable. I have a length from the mining camp. Josiah Reed helped me work out the attachment points. Webb nodded slowly. The eyes. Polished rail bolts. Hollow socket bolt head flush set at the back of the cavity depth. Another nod. Then quietly, almost to himself. Your father knew what he was doing when he taught you. Abby picked up her hammer. Yes, she said. He did. By the 12th day, the barn had become something she hadn't planned for. It had become a place where people came. Not a crowd, never a crowd at once. But farmers drifted in during the late morning with broken plow parts they'd been meaning to discard. 3 ranchers arrived on the same Tuesday with horseshoes from their respective operations, having apparently coordinated without Abby's knowledge, and she'd recorded all 3 in the ledger and given each one a receipt the way Dr. Bell had given her a receipt. A woman named Clara, wife of one of the miners, who'd stayed in the county after the camp closed, brought a basket of food without being asked and sat with Martha for an hour and left without making a speech about it. Josiah came every day now. He had taken ownership of the lifting rig with a quiet authority that Abby respected because the lifting rig was his domain. He'd built better ones than this for 30 years, and she didn't interfere in other people's domains. Caleb coordinated transport of the heavier materials and followed Abby's decisions without debate, which had become, she realized, one of the things she valued most about his presence. Not the lifting. The following. She set rules, and she enforced them, and nobody argued, because the results on the Mustang were visible to everyone who entered the barn, and the results didn't leave room for argument. She was on the Mustang's chest section, plow blades curved and set to suggest the deep, powerful curve of a running animal's breastbone when Crowley arrived. He didn't knock. He walked through the barn door with 2 of his men behind him, a leather folio under his arm, and the particular expression he wore when he wanted people to feel his arrival as weather. 3 workers were in the barn at that moment. Josiah at the lift rig, Webb sorting shoe stock by weight, and Caleb carrying a section of cable for the main. Everyone stopped. Crowley looked at the Mustang. He tried to hide his reaction and failed at it by approximately 2 seconds, long enough for Abby to see his expression shift briefly from anticipated contempt to something sharper and less comfortable. Then the contempt reassembled itself. Well, he said. Mr. Crowley. Abby did not put down her tools. This is a working barn. State your business. I'm here on a matter of legal notice. He opened the folio. The county foreclosure auction has been moved forward. The new date is— You can't move it forward, Abby said. The legal notice period is fixed. Within certain provisions. He produced the document and held it toward her. There is a clause in your father's refinancing agreement allowing acceleration of the foreclosure timeline if the creditor can demonstrate reasonable belief that the property value is being diminished. He paused. I've filed that claim. The auction is now in 14 days. The barn went very quiet. Abby set down her tools and took the document. She read it. All of it, every line, while Crowley stood and watched and waited for her to react. She kept her face completely neutral, which cost her something because her heart was beating hard enough that she could feel it in the cut on her palm that had mostly healed, but not entirely. 14 days. She had lost 9 days. She handed the document back to Crowley. "I'll have my response filed with the county clerk by tomorrow morning." Crowley smiled. Of course. He looked at the Mustang again, and this time he didn't try to hide his assessment. He walked toward it and reached out one hand. "Don't touch my work," Abby said. He stopped. His hand was 6 inches from the Mustang's completed flank section. The barn was completely silent. "Don't touch it," she said again. Her voice was level. "Take your document and your men and leave my property, Mr. Crowley. You've delivered your notice. That's the extent of your business here." Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his hand. "Good day, Miss Mercer." He walked out. Abby stood with her back to the Mustang and listened to his wagon leave the yard. Then she turned and looked at the sculpture at the section she had been working on before he walked in at the 14 days that were now all she had. 9 days, Josiah said from across the barn. "I heard him," she said. "Can we finish in 14s? She looked at the Mustang. The completed section's flank hindquarters, partial chest represented maybe 40% of the outer coat. The head, neck, raised forelegs, and the remaining chest sections were unfinished. The mane and eyes were not started. 14 days. "Yes," she said, and picked up her hammer. 4 days later, the summer storm arrived. It came out of the west in the late afternoon with the kind of speed that Kansas storms specialized in. The sky changed from hazy yellow to green-black in 40 minutes. And by the time Abby heard the first thunder, the wind was already pulling at the barn roof and rattling the door hinges. The barn roof had a weakness in the northwest corner that her father had patched twice, and that she'd been meaning to address since March. She had not addressed it because there had been no money and no time in that order. The storm found the weakness in the first hour. The rain came through the corner in a steady sheet and hit the floor 6 feet from the forge. Within 20 minutes the water was spreading. She built a channel with scrap wood to redirect the flow, but the forge was on the wrong side of the drainage, and when the water reached the base, she had to make a decision: let the fire die or risk the water reaching hot iron and cracking it with thermal shock. She let the fire die. She stood in the flooding barn with the cold forge and the unfinished Mustang and the rain coming through the roof. And she did something she had not done since her father's funeral. She sat down on the barn floor in the water and the dark, and she put her face in her hands. She did not make noise. She was not a woman who made noise when she fell apart. But she fell apart cleanly and completely for approximately 4 minutes, which was all she was going to allow herself. Then she heard boots at the barn door. Caleb came in soaking wet, having ridden from his ranch the moment he saw the storm direction. He took in the flooding, the dead forge, the water spreading across the floor, and Abby sitting in it, and he did not say anything immediately. He found a lantern, lit it, and set it on the high shelf where it wouldn't get wet. Then he sat down on the floor beside her, not in front of her, not crouching in front of her to look at her face. Beside her, with his back against the same wall, in the same water. After a while she said, "Everyone who mocked me might have been right." "No," he said. "I'm sitting in a flooded barn with a half-finished sculpture and 10 days left and a forge that's dead." 10 days and one problem, he said. "The forge can be relit. The roof is. I can fix the roof in the morning. I've got shingle material at the ranch." He paused. "Webb will help. Josiah might if his leg holds." Abby looked at the dead forge. She looked at the water on the floor. She looked at the Mustang standing in the flooding barn, with water around its base plate, unfinished and enormous, and hers. And she said, "I dragged my mother toward a more humiliating defeat. That's what I keep thinking. That I mistook stubbornness for courage, and now we're going to lose everything in front of everyone who expected us to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I could pay the debt," he said. "Right now, tonight. I have enough in reserve." He paused. "But Crowley would call me your rescuer. This town would believe him, and they'd spend the next 20 years telling the story of how Caleb Hart saved the Mercer widow and her daughter. And you would know every day for the rest of your life that the truth of what you built here got buried under that version. He turned his head to look at her. Tell me what you actually need to finish your fight. Abby was quiet for a long time. Iron, she said finally. Coal. People willing to believe my work has value before someone important tells them it does. All right. He stood up. He held out his hand, not to pull her to her feet, she noted, but offered available if she wanted it. The iron and coal we can get. The people. He paused. I have something I can do about the people. She took his hand and stood up. Don't make promises about other people's behavior, she said. I'm going to make a promise about mine, he said. That's all I can speak to. She released his hand. The forge needs to dry before I can relight it. 6 hours minimum. Then we fix the roof in the meantime. He moved to the door. I'll get Webb. It's the middle of the night, she said. Webb lives 4 blocks from here, and he owes you an apology. He's still working out how to pay. Caleb put on his hat. He won't mind being woken up for something useful. He went out into the rain. Abby stood in the wet barn and looked at the Mustang. Then she got up and started bailing water. The next morning, Caleb walked into the Red Willow saloon at 8 o'clock, which was early enough that only the serious drinkers and the ranch hands grabbing coffee were present. He ordered nothing. He stood at the bar and put the iron coyote Abby had traded him on the counter. It landed with a solid sound that turned heads. Look at it, Caleb said. He set it to the room, not to any one person. Look at it properly. People looked. The coyote was mid-motion. One foreleg raised its head, turned 3/4 as if it had heard something and was deciding whether to run or hold still. The detail in the face was extraordinary. The suggestion of alertness, the slight tension in the haunches, all achieved in iron from nails and wire. Abigail Mercer made that, Caleb said, out of materials she pulled from your discard piles. He let that land. You laughed at her for collecting scrap. She turned your garbage into this. Another pause. She has 10 days to finish a 9-foot iron Mustang that could put Red Willow on the map in front of every railroad buyer who attends Founders Day. If she finishes it. He looked around the room. She's short on horseshoes. She's short on coal. The barn roof is being fixed this morning. He picked up his hat. I'm not asking anyone for anything. I'm telling you what's true and what's possible. What you do with that is your own conscience's business. He put on his hat and walked out. The coyote stayed on the bar. By noon, 2 ranchers had arrived at the Mercer barn with horseshoe sacks. By 3 o'clock, a farmer brought plow scrap. By evening, Josiah counted enough material for the remaining sections, and Webb arrived last with 2 sacks of coal and set them down inside the door without ceremony, and said to Abby, I should have said something. Outside my shop that morning, I should have said something. Abby looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. She picked up her hammer. Help me sort the shoe stock by weight and we'll call it settled. Webb took off his coat and started sorting. The forge was lit by 6 that evening, and by 7, the barn was running at full capacity, and Abby's hammer was ringing out across the Red Willow night in a sound that carried further than she knew. She did not know at that moment that Crowley's clerk was standing at the edge of her property in the dark. She did not know what he was carrying. She found out later, and by then, it would change everything. Caleb caught him at 2:30 in the morning. He had been riding the perimeter of the Mercer property every night since the joining plate went missing, adjusting his route the way he'd told Abby he would without ceremony and without announcement. He wasn't a man who needed credit for keeping a promise. He just kept it. The clerk's name was Edmund Price, and he was 23 years old, and he was standing at the east corner of the barn with a lantern in one hand and a tin of lamp oil in the other. And when Caleb's horse came around the corner, Price froze the way rabbits freeze completely uselessly, every instinct failing him at once. Caleb dismounted before the horse fully stopped. He took the lamp oil out of Price's hand. He took the lantern. He set both on the ground. Then he stood in front of the young man in the dark and said very quietly, "Start talking." Price talked. It came out in pieces, the way confessions always do. The relevant parts tangled up with the self-justifying parts, the fear making the chronology jumble. Caleb stood and listened and sorted it as it arrived. Crowley had approached Price 6 weeks ago. Price owed a gambling debt to one of Crowley's associates $42, which was more than 3 months of his clerk's salary. Crowley had offered to erase the debt entirely in exchange for 2 things: information about Abby's finances and progress, and if the sculpture looked like it might actually succeed, destruction of the barn before the auction date. He said it had to look like an accident, Price said. His voice was shaking. Lamp fire. He said lamp fires happen in barns all the time. They do, Caleb said, with the people inside. Price went white. He said it would be empty. He said I should wait until... The forge runs until 2 in the morning. Miss Mercer is in that barn until 2 in the morning. Caleb's voice had not changed volume or temperature, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. You were planning to set fire to a working barn. Price looked like he might be sick. I didn't know, he said. I didn't think... No, Caleb said. You didn't. He picked up the lamp oil and the lantern. Here's what happens now. You're going to ride to Sheriff Doyle's house, and you're going to knock on his door, and you're going to tell him exactly what you told me. Every word, including Crowley's name and the debt arrangement and the instruction about the fire. It's 3 in the morning, Price said weakly. Sheriff Doyle is going to be annoyed, Caleb agreed. Go anyway. Price went. Caleb stood alone outside Abby's barn for a moment, listening to the sound of her hammer still going inside. Steady focused, the particular rhythm she'd developed over the past week of intensive work that she didn't vary even when she was exhausted. He thought about the lantern and the lamp oil. He thought about what would have happened if he'd ridden past 20 minutes later. He put his hand flat against the barn wall for a moment. Just for a moment. Then he walked to the door and knocked twice, which was the signal they'd established, so she wouldn't startle and drop hot iron. Come in, she said. He went in and told her. She listened without interrupting. Her hammer had stopped when he started talking, and she hadn't picked it back up. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face completely still in the forge light, and he watched her process it, not the fear which he could see she was managing, but the calculation. He could see her calculating. Price is going to Doyle now, she said. I sent him directly. Crowley will say Price is lying, that the debt arrangement is fabricated. Probably, Caleb said. But Doyle will investigate. An investigation creates delay, and delay gives you time, she said. It might give me time. She picked up her hammer. How close was he to the door? East corner. She nodded once. Then she went back to work. He stayed until sunrise. Sheriff Thomas Doyle arrived at the Mercer barn at 7 in the morning, with Price in tow and the particular expression of a man who had not slept and was not happy about it. He was 48, lean through the face, with the kind of careful eyes that came from years of listening to people tell him things that weren't entirely true and learning to hear the difference. He took Abby's statement in the yard. He took Caleb's statement. He looked at the lamp oil tin which Caleb had kept as evidence. He looked at Price, who was telling the same story he'd told at 3 in the morning, which was a good sign. Liars' stories changed with the daylight. I'll bring this to Crowley this morning, Doyle said. He'll deny it. I know, Abby said. Price's testimony establishes intent, but intent alone doesn't stop the auction. The debt is real, and the foreclosure filing is legal. Doyle looked at her directly. Miss Mercer, I want to be plain with you. I can investigate Crowley for the arson plot. I can delay his ability to conduct business freely while that investigation proceeds. What I cannot do is cancel a legal foreclosure on testimony alone. I understand, Abby said. You have 10 days. 9 after today. Doyle nodded. He turned to go, then stopped. He turned back. He looked at the barn door, then at Abby. I heard about what's in there, he said. From 3 different people yesterday, which means by now most of the town has heard. He paused. I don't have authority to tell you whether your sculpture will sell or what it's worth. But I've been sheriff of this county for 11 years, and I know what Founders Day brings through Red Willow in terms of buyers. He settled his hat. Finish it, Miss Mercer. He left. Abby stood in the yard and looked at 9 days and everything that still needed doing, And then she went back into the barn and picked up her hammer and did not put it down again for 6 hours straight. The Mustang's head was the last section, and she had been saving it. Not because it was the most technically complex, though it was, but because it was the piece that would determine whether the sculpture was merely impressive or whether it was alive. The difference, she knew, lived in very small decisions: the angle of the jaw, the degree of tension in the neck muscles suggested by iron curves, the placement of the eyes. She had been thinking about the head for 3 weeks. The shape lived in her hands already, she could feel it. The way she felt a completed weld before she made it, the knowledge preceding the action. She just had to execute it. She worked the head alone, not because she was being precious about it. There were practical reasons. The head required constant adjustment of small details that couldn't be interrupted by coordination with other people. Every few minutes, she needed to step back and look and step forward and change something. A process that required the barn to be quiet. She told everyone on the morning of the 6th day she was doing the head, she needed the barn, she would be done by evening. Josiah looked at the neck joint where the head would attach. He looked at the lifting rig. He said, "You'll need the rig when you set the head. Can't do that alone." "I know," she said. "Be back at 6. He nodded and left. Martha brought food at noon and left it on the shelf without speaking, which was the kind of love that didn't require an audience. Caleb stopped at the door at 2 in the afternoon, looked in, saw what she was doing, and left without a word. She worked for 11 hours. The head came together, the way she had felt it would. Jawline first, the angle set to suggest the animal was looking forward rather than up, which gave it purpose rather than panic. Then the cheekbones, the flared nostrils shaped from curved flat stock, the ear laid back but not flat. The position of an animal alert to something it hasn't decided is a threat yet. She used the spare nail Josiah had given her to score the surface of the jaw in fine lines that suggested muscle tension under skin. The eyes. She had the polished rail bolts ready. She had thought about the eye placement for days too far forward, and the Mustang would look dull too far back, and it would look afraid. She set them by touch as much as by measurement, making small adjustments until the angle felt right, and then she stepped back and looked. The Mustang looked back, not literally. But the hollow socket and the polished bolt at depth created something in the light that was not literal and did not need to be. It was the impression of attention, of presence, of a creature that had been through something and come out the other side without apology. She stood there for a long time. Then she said out loud to no one, "Papa, look what we made." Josiah came back at 6 with Webb behind him, and they set the head together with the lifting rig, and when it locked into the neck joint, and Josiah released the rig tension, and the head held 9 feet of iron Mustang, standing on its own complete headset, and eyes catching the forge light. Webb sat down on the nearest barrel and put his face in his hands. "Lord," Josiah said quietly. Abby walked around it, slowly checking every joint, every weld, every attachment point. She found 2 places that needed small corrections and made them. Then she walked around it again. She picked up a wire brush and cleaned the base plate. She added nothing to the rust. She removed nothing from it. The flanks of the Mustang carried the history of every broken shoe she had collected, every piece of iron people had thrown away, or left to deteriorate the real color of things that have been used and survived the using. She left it exactly as it was. "The main," Josiah said. The steel cable was the last element. She had separated the cable strands over 3 evenings until each one could move independently. And now she attached them to the placement points along the neck and the peak of the head in sections that curved forward and outward, suggesting motion and wind, and the particular wild freedom of an animal that has never been broken. She attached the last strand at midnight. She stepped back. "All right," she said. "Everyone out. No one sees it in full light until morning." The night before the auction, she could not sleep. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and went through the list, the way she always went through lists, methodically, item by item, checking and rechecking. Dr. Bell's receipt. Caleb's trade ledger entry. The community contribution ledger with every donor recorded and signed. The letter from the Founders Day Exhibition Committee confirming the Mustang's entry. the replacement joining plates, the barn roof repaired, Price's confession documented, and against all of it, $420. 14 days accelerated by Crowley's legal maneuver, the auction beginning at noon. She thought about Margaret Holloway, owner of the Railroad Hotel, who had heard about the project from 3 separate people, and sent a note through Dr. Bell 2 days ago saying she intended to attend the auction personally. She thought about the railroad representative who had been in town for Founders Day planning, and who had asked Josiah apparently whether the Mustang was structurally stable enough for outdoor installation. She thought about Caleb. She had been trying not to think about Caleb specifically, because there was an order to things, and saving the ranch came before everything else. But she thought about him sitting on the flooded barn floor beside her in the dark. She thought about him saying, "Tell me what you actually need to finish your fight." She thought about the way he had stood at the barn door and seen what she was doing and left without interrupting, and how that particular form of respect was rarer than almost anything she had ever been given. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the barn. She sat in front of the Mustang in the dark for an hour. Just sat with it. She didn't hammer anything. She didn't adjust anything. She just sat in the presence of the thing she had built from everything people had thrown at her feet, and let herself feel the full weight of what it was. Her father had told her once that the truest thing about iron was that it remembered. Every strike of the hammer left a mark in the crystalline structure of the metal, even when you couldn't see it. The finished object carried the entire history of its making. There was no such thing as an iron piece that didn't remember the hands that shaped it. She pressed her palm against the Mustang's flank, against the layered horseshoes, the rust, the welded edges. "Hold," she said to it. "Just hold." "Oh." They came at 11. Crowley arrived first, which she had expected. He had the county clerk with him, a man named Patterson, who did not look pleased to be associated with the morning's business, and showed it by keeping his eyes on his paperwork. 2 attorneys Abby had never seen before flanked Crowley city men she thought brought in from Wichita for the occasion, which told her how much Crowley wanted this property and how certain he had been of getting it. Sheriff Doyle was already in the yard when they arrived. He had come early, which Abby noted and filed. He met Crowley at the gate with the expression of a man who had information he was managing carefully. "Mr. Crowley," Doyle said, "before the auction proceeds, I need to inform you that your employee, Edmund Price, has provided a sworn statement to this office regarding an alleged arrangement to commit arson on this property." Crowley's expression did not change. Edmund Price is a confused young man with a gambling problem and an incentive to blame others for his own actions. "That may be," Doyle said. "The investigation is ongoing. It doesn't affect the auction proceeding, but it does affect your personal freedom of movement while it proceeds. You're asked to remain available for questioning." "I'm always available for legitimate inquiries," Crowley said smoothly. He looked past Doyle at Abby, who was standing on the barn steps. "Shall we begin?" People had been arriving for 20 minutes. Not the crowd she might have hoped for. This was not a celebration yet, but more than she had expected. Dr. Bell was there, standing near the fence with his hat in his hands. Webb was there. Josiah had arrived on his borrowed horse and hitched it to the post with the careful deliberateness of a man who intended to be present for what happened. 3 ranchers whose names were in her contribution ledger. Martha was on the porch with her hands folded, wearing her good dress, her face composed into the expression Abby recognized as her mother's version of armor, and Caleb standing to the left of the barn door. Not in front of it. To the left of it. Exactly where Abby had room to stand to the right. He caught her eye. He did not nod or gesture. He just looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks, with the particular attention of a man who has decided something and is no longer uncertain about it. She looked away first. There was work to do. Crowley addressed the county clerk. "The property is being offered at foreclosure auction. Opening bid is the outstanding debt of $420. Do we have any documents from the debtor?" "We do," Abby said. She walked down from the barn steps. She had the ledger under her arm and the documents folded in her apron pocket, and she crossed the yard to the county clerk and laid them out one by one on the fence post he was using as a makeshift table. Dr. Walter Bell's receipt for the first commissioned iron sculpture. She set it down. Caleb Hart's trade ledger entry for material exchange witnessed and signed. Down. Community contribution ledger 41 entries, each signed by the contributor. Down. Entry confirmation from the Founders Day Exhibition Committee. Down. And this. She produced the last document, a letter on railroad company stationery that had arrived yesterday afternoon by Ryder. A letter from the Kansas Pacific Railroad confirming interest in commissioning the Iron Mustang currently housed in this barn for installation at the new Red Willow Depot. Signed by the Regional Acquisitions Representative. The yard had gone quiet. Patterson, the county clerk, was reading the railroad letter. Crowley was very still. "This letter expresses interest," one of his Wichita attorneys said. "It is not a purchase agreement. It establishes no concrete monetary value. It establishes that the work has commercial interest from a major railroad company," Abby said, "which establishes that it has value beyond personal art, which I believe is relevant to the auction proceeding. Miss Mercer." Crowley stepped forward. His voice had the particular quality it took on when he was performing patience he did not feel. "The debt is real. The auction is legal. Whatever is in your barn is irrelevant to the mortgage obligation." "Then let's find out what's in the barn," Margaret Holloway said. She had come around the side of the house, having apparently arrived while everyone was focused on the document exchange. She was 58 broad through the shoulders, with the face of a woman who had run a business in a frontier town for 20 years and had not survived it by being delicate. She was wearing her good clothes, which meant she had dressed for a transaction. She looked at Abby. "Open the doors, Miss Mercer. Let us see what we're discussing." Crowley turned to her. "Mrs. Holloway, this is a legal proceeding. I'm aware of what it is." She looked at him flatly. "I'm also aware that I have a right to be on this property, as I have been invited by Miss Mercer, and that I have a professional interest in the contents of that barn." She looked back at Abby. "Open it." Abby looked at Crowley. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has run out of the moves he planned and is deciding whether to improvise or concede. He chose improvise. "Open the doors, Miss Mercer," he said in the tone he used when he wanted to sound magnanimous. "Let everyone see what you traded your mother's home for." Abby took off her leather gloves. She looked at Caleb. He was already at the left door, not because she had asked him, but because he had been watching her eyes and knew. He looked at her and waited. "Beside me," she said. "Not in front." "Yes, ma'am," he said. They opened the doors together. The summer light came in hard and honest, and it hit the Mustang full on all 9 feet of it, rearing on its hind legs with its chest forward, and its mane lifted in steel cable strands, and its coat made from 400 broken horseshoes that had been thrown into dust and scrap piles across Red Willow County. The rust on the flanks caught the light and turned it copper and amber. The polished rail bolt eyes caught it and held it. The yard went silent. Not the polite silence of people being appropriate. The real silence. The involuntary kind, the kind that falls when something exceeds the space a person had prepared for it. Caleb removed his hat. Webb made a sound that was not quite a word. Josiah stood with his hand on his walking stick and his eyes bright and said nothing at all. Martha on the porch pressed both hands to her mouth, and Sheriff Doyle, who had the auction papers in his hand, who had the legal obligation to continue the proceeding, stood with those papers at his side and forgot them for a full 30 seconds. Crowley looked at the Mustang. Whatever he had expected was not this. She could see it in the way his posture changed, not the slumping of defeat, not yet, but the recalibration of a man who had been operating on one set of assumptions and has just had them revised without his permission. Margaret Holloway walked past him into the barn. She stood in front of the Mustang for a long time. She walked around it the way Webb had walked around it, the way everyone who understood craft walked around craft, attending to it, taking it seriously. She looked at the base plate. She looked at the weld points. She looked at the eyes. She turned around. $700, she said. The yard came back to life. For the sculpture, she continued to Patterson, the county clerk. Cash transaction contingent on a written bill of sale and transport after Founders Day. I want it outside the hotel entrance. The railroad representative, a younger man in a good coat who had been standing near the fence and whom Abby had noted but not addressed, stepped forward. $850. Kansas Pacific wants it at the depot. Better visibility for travelers. Margaret Holloway looked at him. The hotel is the first thing people see coming off the stage line, she said. The depot is the first thing they see coming off the train, he said. And there are more of them. Abby looked at Patterson. Can the auction proceed with competing offers from private buyers? Patterson had not anticipated this exact situation, but he was a competent man. The auction is for the property. If the debt is satisfied by other means before the gavel falls, the property is released. A private sale of the sculpture that generates the satisfaction amount. He checked his documents. Would legally satisfy the foreclosure. Crowley's attorney started to object. Doyle looked at him. He stopped. Abby turned to the railroad representative and Margaret Holloway. $900, she said. Whoever agrees to a written contract transport costs assumed by the buyer installation to be completed before the first day of October. A pause. The railroad representative looked at his letter of interest. He looked at the Mustang. He made the calculation that people make when they have something in front of them that they know will be worth more than they're paying. Agreed, he said. Margaret Holloway looked at the Mustang one more time. She looked at Abby. You'll make another one, Holloway said. It was not a question. Not the same one, Abby said. No. Holloway almost smiled. Something else. I'll be first in line when you do. She stepped back. Let her sell it to the railroad. The depot's better placement. Patterson had the sale document drafted in 15 minutes, working from the fence post with Doyle watching over his shoulder. The railroad representative signed. Abby signed. $900 certified and witnessed. Patterson counted out the payment in front of everyone, $420 transferred directly to Crowley's account against the mortgage debt the remainder held for Abby in a documented transaction. Crowley stood very still through all of it. Doyle turned to him. The debt is satisfied, Mr. Crowley. You'll sign the lien release. I'll review it with my attorneys, Crowley said. You'll sign it now, Doyle said pleasantly. In front of witnesses, or I'll have some additional questions for you about the price situation that might take the rest of the afternoon. Crowley signed the lien release. Patterson recorded it. Doyle witnessed it. The deed was handed to Abby, who carried it across the yard and up the porch steps and placed it in her mother's hands. Martha looked at the deed. She looked at her daughter. You saved more than our land, she said quietly enough that it was only for Abby. You made this town see what it had trained itself not to see. Abby stood on the porch of her father's ranch with the summer heat on her face and $420 worth of debt gone from her shoulders, and she felt the absence of it, the particular lightness of a weight removed that you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing its full mass. She stood there for a moment. Just that. Then she went back down the porch steps because there were people to speak to and accounts to settle and a contribution ledger to honor, and Abby Mercer did not leave accounts unsettled. She found Caleb at the edge of the yard, watching the crowd begin to disperse his hat back on his head and his hands easy at his sides. She stopped beside him. Not in front of him. Beside him. Hart, she said. Mercer, he said. A pause. I've been thinking about what you said, she said. In the barn, when the forge went cold, she looked straight ahead. About what you could give me that I'd actually want. I remember what I said. You asked what I needed to finish my fight. She paused. I've been thinking about what comes after the fight. Whether there's a version of after where someone like you is still in it. He was quiet for a moment. Someone like me, he repeated. What does that mean exactly? Someone who asks before helping, she said. Someone who sits on a flooded barn floor instead of making speeches. Someone who shows me a coyote on a saloon bar and lets the room decide what to do with it instead of telling them. She looked at him. Someone who stands beside and not in front. Caleb looked at her. He had the expression she had come to recognize as his genuine one, not the careful neutral face, not the public composure, but the direct and undefended thing underneath. I'd very much like to be in the after, he said. One supper, she said. That's what I'm offering. One supper is not a promise. No, ma'am. A pause. But it's more than I had this morning, and exactly as much as I asked for. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the barn, at the Mustang visible through the open doors, at the summer light still coming through and making the iron coat glow the color of something that had been through fire and come out better than it started. "Sunday," she said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." "I won't be," he said. She walked back toward the barn, toward the contribution ledger, and the people waiting for their receipts, and the beginning of whatever came next. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The Sunday supper was not what either of them expected. Caleb arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, which Martha noted with the particular satisfaction of a woman who considers punctuality a moral quality. He brought nothing except himself and his hat in his hand, which was the right call. A man who brings flowers to a woman who works iron for a living has misread the room. And when Martha opened the door, she looked him over once, with the thoroughness of a woman who had been patient long enough, and said, "You're on time. Come in." Abby was at the kitchen table with the contribution ledger open, finishing the last of the distribution calculations. She had been at it since 4 in the afternoon. She did not close the ledger when Caleb sat down, because the calculations needed to be right, and she had 3 entries left, and a man worth having supper with was a man who could wait 6 minutes while she finished her work. Caleb waited. He looked around the kitchen without commentary. He accepted the coffee Martha put in front of him and said thank you, with the natural ease of a man who actually meant it rather than performing it. Abby closed the ledger. 6 minutes, she said. 5.5, he said. She almost smiled. Every contributor gets their proportional share of the proceeds above the debt. I'm sending the payments out Monday morning. How much above the debt? $480 after material costs. She put the ledger on the shelf. 41 contributors. Some get $2. Webb gets 40 because he came in with coal and stock material when I had nothing. Josiah gets 60 because without the lift rig, the head section would have taken 2 more days we didn't have. And you? Caleb asked. I get the rest, she said. And the ranch. And the right to say I paid every debt I owed. Martha put supper on the table, and the 3 of them ate, and the conversation that happened was the kind of conversation that matters, not careful or performed, but real. Caleb talked about his brother the way he hadn't talked about him before, and Abby talked about her father, and Martha talked about both of them with the unguarded honesty of a woman who had been quiet for 16 months and was ready to stop. They did not talk about Crowley. They did not talk about the auction or the documents or any of it. It was done, and the supper table was not the place for done things. When Caleb left at 9 o'clock, he stopped at the door and looked at Abby. Same time next Sunday, he asked. She considered it for exactly long enough that he didn't know the answer yet. Bring something, she said. I don't care what, just bring something that matters to you. He nodded once. He put on his hat. He left. Martha stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out and said to no one in particular, He'll bring something good. Maybe, Abby said, and went to lock the barn. The following week hit her like a second storm, except this one was made of opportunity instead of rain. It started with a letter from the Kansas Pacific Railroad confirming transport arrangements for the Mustang. It was followed by a visit from Patterson, the county clerk, who came not on official business, but because his wife had asked him to inquire whether Miss Mercer accepted commissions. His wife wanted a small iron bird, a meadowlark, specifically for a memorial marker in the county cemetery. Abby wrote the commission into a new ledger. Separate from the ranch accounts. The first entry in what she decided that evening to call the Mercer Ironworks ledger. The second commission came from the rancher who had bought the owl in the hardware store. He wanted a gate-piece decorative ironwork for the entrance of his property, incorporating his brand mark. She quoted him a fair price and wrote it down. The third came from Margaret Holloway, who had said she'd be first in line for something new and meant it. She wanted a piece for the hotel lobby. She did not specify what. She said she trusted Abby's judgment, which was both the simplest and the most valuable thing a client could say. 3 commissions in 7 days. Against $420 of former debt. Against the laughter outside Webb's shop. Against every person who had looked at her hands and decided they already knew what those hands were capable of. She worked the Meadowlark commission first, because it was the smallest, and because grief was not something she made people wait on. She finished it in 3 days and delivered it to Patterson's wife, who held it for a long moment without speaking and then said very quietly, "She would have loved this." Abby rode home with the payment in her pocket and the particular feeling of work that has gone exactly where it was needed. She did not cry about it until she was back in the barn, which was where she did all the crying she allowed herself. And even then, it was brief and clean, and afterward, she lit the forge. The second Sunday, Caleb brought a leather-bound journal. It was old, the spine cracked, the pages thickened with use, and he set it on the table without explanation and let her pick it up. She opened it. His brother's handwriting on this first page. Then, Caleb's own in different ink beginning 50 pages, in continuing to the last third of the book, which was blank. "Ranch records," he said. "Going back 14 years. What worked, what failed, what we tried in bad seasons." He paused. "I've been running his methods for 4 years. I've been writing my own in the back section for 6 months. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd understand what it means to carry someone else's work and try to figure out where yours starts." Abby looked at the two handwritings side by side on one page. "I do," she said. She handed it back carefully. They talked for 3 hours that evening, and what they talked about was the substance of their actual lives, not performance, not courtship, in the formal sense, but the real material. What scared them, what they were building, what they wanted that they hadn't said out loud to anyone. Caleb talked about the drought coming. He'd seen the water tables dropping for 2 seasons, and he knew what it meant. Abby talked about the 2 women she'd decided to train as blacksmiths, not girls' women, adult women who had been turned away from Webb's apprenticeship program because Webb had not at that time been the man he was becoming. "Webb agreed to that?" Caleb asked. "Webb suggested it," she said. "Came to me 4 days ago and said he'd been thinking about the apprenticeships he'd refused over the years and felt the weight of it. Asked if I'd be willing to run the training if he provided the second forge space." She paused. "I told him I'd run the training in my own barn, and he was welcome to visit and observe." Caleb looked at her. "You didn't give him the easier version," he said. "He didn't earn the easier version yet," she said. "But he's working toward it. I'll know when he gets there." "How?" "Because the women he turned away will tell me," she said. "I'm asking them. Their read of him matters more than mine." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to change this town." "I'm going to change my barn," she said. "What the town does with that is the town's business." He smiled. It was the real one, not the polite one he wore in public, but the one that arrived when something surprised him into it. She had catalogued it without meaning, to the way you catalog things you find yourself looking for. "Same time next week?" he asked at the door. "Yes," she said. Without the pause this time, he noticed. He didn't comment on it. He put on his hat and left, and she stood at the door and watched him go and thought, beside me, not in front. Every time. Every single time, exactly right. 6 weeks after the auction, the investigation into Silas Crowley produced its first formal result. Doyle came to the barn on a Tuesday morning while Abby was working the gate commission, and he stood at the door with his hat in his hand, which she had learned meant he was there as a person and not as the sheriff, and he told her what they'd found. Crowley had been concealing information about the railroad spur proposal while pressuring landowners along the projected route to default on loans he held, at terms he had deliberately made unsustainable. He had done it to 4 families in the county, of which the Mercers were one. The land he had acquired through those foreclosures sat directly on the proposed spur line and would have been worth, by conservative railroad estimates, 6 to 8 times what he'd paid for it. 3 of the 4 families had already lost their land before Abby's auction. She set down her hammer when Doyle finished. "The other 3 families," she said. 2 have grounds for civil claim based on the concealed information," Doyle said. "The 3rd signed a document that—" He paused. "The 3rd situation is more complicated. Who's representing them?" "No one yet. The circuit attorney hasn't been formally approached." Abby picked up her hammer. She made 2 strikes on the gate iron, thinking. Then she set it down again and went to the shelf and came back with the original refinancing agreement. Her father had signed the one she had read 3 times, the one with the penalty clauses her father hadn't understood. She held it out to Doyle. I've marked the sections where the terms changed between the first and second pages, she said. I believe my father was shown a different document than the one he signed. I can't prove intent, but I can show the internal inconsistency. She paused. If the circuit attorney needs documentation of the method Crowley used, this is the clearest example I have. If it helps the other families, use it. Doyle took the document and looked at her. This is your primary evidence, he said, for your own claim. I know, she said. I don't need a claim. I have the deed. She picked up her hammer again. They don't have theirs. Doyle stood at the barn door for a moment after she turned back to the forge. He put his hat on. Your father would be... he started. I know, she said. Thank you, Sheriff. He left. She worked the gate iron for another hour before she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done. Handed over her strongest evidence to help people she barely knew, because it was right, because Crowley's scheme had a human cost that extended past her own yard, and because Abby Mercer had never once in her life been able to look at an injustice and decide it was someone else's problem to carry. Her arm was tired, and the gate iron was taking shape beautifully, and somewhere in the yard she could hear Martha singing to herself, which she only did when things were genuinely all right. She kept working. The Mustang left Red Willow on a Thursday in late September, transported by the Kansas Pacific Railroad on a specially rigged flat car with 4 workers, and Josiah Reed supervising the loading, because Abby had asked him to, and because Josiah had taken a proprietary interest in the lift rig and was not about to let railroad workers improvise. Abby watched it go from the road. She did not feel the loss she had braced herself for. She felt something different, the clean, specific satisfaction of a thing completed and released. The Mustang was not hers anymore, in the way the drawing in the dirt had been hers. It belonged to the town now, and the railroad, and the travelers who would see it outside the depot and wonder about it, and eventually to all the time that would pass over it. That was correct. That was exactly what it was supposed to do. She rode back to the barn and started on the Meadowlark follow-up commission. Patterson's wife had come back and asked for a second piece, a running horse for her son's birthday. Small, palm-sized, the size of something you could hold when you needed to remember something. She understood exactly what the woman meant. She started on it that evening. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on the first Monday of October, and it came in the form of a letter from the Kansas Pacific Railroad's regional director. Not the acquisitions representative, the director himself. He wrote that the Mustang had been installed at the Red Willow Depot on Saturday. He wrote that it had generated in 2 days more comment from travelers and railroad staff than any installation the company had commissioned in the previous 5 years. He wrote that the Kansas Pacific was interested in commissioning 3 additional pieces for stations along the eastern Kansas line. Similar scale, similar approach, subject to negotiation with the artist. 3 commissions. Railroad scale. From the Kansas Pacific. Abby read the letter twice at the kitchen table with Martha across from her and her coffee going cold. Then she put the letter down. Then she picked it up and read it a 3rd time. Well, Martha said. Don't, Abby said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say Papa would have been proud. I was going to say you're going to need a bigger barn, Martha said. Abby looked at her mother. Then she laughed. Not the involuntary short laugh from the wagon, but a real one, the full kind. The kind that came from somewhere that had been closed for 16 months and was finally genuinely open again. Martha laughed too. They sat at the kitchen table in the ranch her father had built and laughed until the coffee was completely cold, and neither of them minded at all. She told Caleb on Sunday. She put the letter on the table between them without preamble, and he read it, and when he looked up, his expression was the real one, the surprised, undefended one she had catalogued without meaning to. 3 commissions, he said, subject to negotiation. From the Kansas Pacific Railroad. That's what it says. He looked at the letter again. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing between several responses and discarding all the ones that would have been too much. You're going to need help, he said. Not from me, I don't know iron. But trained help, sustained capacity. The 2 women I'm training, she said. Clara Jennings and Ruth Webb, yes, Franklin Webb's sister, which was his idea, and I thought it was a reasonable one. They're both further along than I expected. Clara's got the patience for detail work. Ruth's stronger on structural. How long until they can work commissions independently? 6 months for assisted work. A year before I'd trust either of them fully alone. She paused. I'll need a second forge before spring. I know where you can get the iron for it, he said. At a fair price, she said. At a fair price, he agreed. They looked at each other across the table. Caleb, she said. Abby, he said. I want to tell you something and I need you to hear it without making it into more than it is yet. He set his hands flat on the table. All right. I have spent my entire life being looked at and found wanting, she said, by people who decided what I was worth before they knew anything real about me. And I've spent so long managing the judgment, working around it, proving things. I shouldn't have had to prove that I don't always know when someone is good to me, whether it's real or whether I've just gotten better at wanting it to be. She met his eyes. I need you to know that I'm watching. Not because I don't trust you. Because trusting you matters enough to me that I won't do it carelessly. Caleb held her gaze. Watch as long as you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. You say that now. I'll say it in 6 months, he said. And the 6 months after that. He paused. I'm not a man who changes his mind about things that matter. Ask my ranch hands. They'll tell you it's occasionally irritating. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest that had been braced for a very long time made a small, quiet adjustment. One more thing, she said. Name it. If you ever go quiet when someone laughs at me, she said, it's the Last Supper. Understood, he said without hesitation. Good, she said. Pass the biscuits. Crowley's formal charges were filed in November. 3 counts of fraudulent concealment related to the railroad spur information. 2 counts of predatory lending with documented intent to foreclose. 1 count related to the conspiracy with Price, which Price himself had testified to in a written deposition that ran to 14 pages, because Price, once he started talking, found it difficult to stop. 2 of the 3 families, whose land Crowley had taken, filed civil claims. The circuit attorney, armed with Abby's original refinancing document and the internal inconsistency she had marked, built the core of the fraud case around it. Crowley lost his position at the bank in October. His personal assets were frozen, pending the civil proceedings in December. The attorneys from Wichita stopped returning his letters. Abby was not in the courtroom for any of it. She was in the barn. She had work to do, and justice, real justice. The lasting kind was not a spectator event. It was what happened when enough people told the truth at the same time, and then kept building while the legal system caught up with the facts on the ground. She had told her truth. She had given Doyle the document. The rest was the circuit attorney's work, and Abby had enough of her own. Webb stopped by the barn on the day the charges were announced and stood at the door and said, "Did you hear about Crowley?" "Yes," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about it genuinely before she answered. She thought about her father signing the refinancing agreement he didn't fully understand. She thought about 16 months of debt and sleeplessness and cold biscuits standing at the kitchen basin. She thought about the horseshoe thrown in the dirt at her feet. "I feel like that's what happens when someone builds their life on what they've taken from other people," she said. "The structure doesn't hold." She went back to the commission piece. "The work holds. Build the work." Webb nodded slowly. He turned to go. "Webb," she said. He stopped. "Ruth's doing well," she said. "She's got your eye for joint work. You should come see." He came in and looked at what Ruth had done on the smaller commission piece. The meadowlark follow up the running horse for Patterson's son, and he stood there for a while with his arms crossed and said nothing, and then said, "That joint on the left foreleg." "I know," Abby said. "I'm having her redo it tomorrow. Show her the inside angle first. She's approaching it from the surface." "That's what I was going to show her." "Good." He paused. She's better than I expected. She's better than you let her be," Abby said. "There's a difference." Webb took that. He was getting better at taking things. She had noticed. 8 months after the auction, on a warm evening in late spring, Caleb Hart rode into the Mercer yard and hitched his horse and came to the barn door and knocked twice. "Come in," Abby said. He came in. The barn was different now. A second forge occupied the north corner, smaller than the primary, but well built with proper ventilation that Josiah had designed and Caleb had helped install over 3 weekends in February. The shelving along the east wall held finished pieces in various stages. 3 railroad commissions in progress, 2 local pieces, and a 4th small animal that Abby made without a commission, just because she wanted to, which was new. The ledger sat on its shelf, thick with entries. Now Mercer Ironworks in Abby's handwriting on the cover. Ruth Webb was gone for the day. Clara Jennings had left an hour ago. The barn was quiet except for the sound of the cooling forge. Caleb was holding something behind his back. Abby set down her tools and looked at him. "What is that?" she said. He brought it forward. It was the horseshoe. The cracked one split cleanly through the heel. The first one she had ever picked up from the dirt outside Webb's shop, the one the cowboy had thrown at her feet. She stared at it. "I found it under the wagon after you drove away that morning," he said. "I don't know why I kept it. I told myself it was because I was going to return it. Then I kept not returning it." He turned it over in his hands. "I think I kept it because I knew even then that I had made the wrong choice by staying quiet, and I couldn't—" He stopped, started again. "I couldn't let it go until I gave it back to the right person." Abby took the horseshoe from him. She turned it over. She felt the crack along the heel, the jagged edge that had cut through her glove. She had bled for this piece of iron. She had held it in her hand when she told Crowley to pray it remained rust. She had taken it home in the dark and put it in the fire and made the first attempt that failed, and the second attempt that became the running Mustang she still had on the shelf above the water barrel. She looked at Caleb. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it plainly, not sideways, because I think you've earned plain." "Ask it," she said. "Would you let me build a life beside yours?" The barn was completely quiet. Abby looked at the horseshoe in her hands. She thought about 8 months of Sunday suppers, and a leather-bound journal, with 2 kinds of handwriting, and a man who stood to the left of barn doors, and asked before helping, and went quiet in rooms where he should have spoken, and came back anyway, and kept coming back with the steady reliability of someone who had made a decision and didn't require the decision to be applauded. She looked at him. "Beside me," she said. "Always," he said. She crossed the barn to the forge. She put the horseshoe in the fire. He watched her without speaking because he had been learning for 8 months that Abby Mercer's silences were not absences. They were the sound of thought, of decision, of a woman who did not commit to anything she hadn't fully examined. She worked the horseshoe for a long time. When she pulled it out, she did not shape it into an animal. She bent it slowly, carefully into a curve. Then she reheated it and bent it further into a full circle. Then she reheated it one more time and took a second piece of iron and bent that one into a circle too, and worked them together at the join point until they interlocked the 2 circles holding each other at the crossing point, each one incomplete without the other, each one bearing the marks of what it had been before. She held it up. Imperfect. Strong. The cracks still visible in the original metal, the marks of the hammer clear, the rust from the dirt still visible along the heel edge. She handed it to him. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. He closed his hand around it. They stood in the barn that Silas Mercer had built, beside the forge that had saved the land in the silence that neither of them needed to fill, and Caleb Hart held 2 interlocked circles of imperfect iron, and understood that he was holding the truest answer she knew how to give. Not a speech, not a promise made in words, but something she had made with her hands from what the world had thrown at her feet. He kissed her the way she had always believed a kiss ought to work. Not as punctuation, not as conclusion, but as the beginning of a sentence they were only just starting to write. She let him. Afterward, she went back to the anvil because there was still work to do, and the railroad commissions didn't finish themselves, and Caleb sat on the barrel stool and watched her work, and did not offer to help, and did not fill the air with words, and that was exactly and precisely right. The people of Red Willow had looked at Abigail Mercer and seen a woman who was too large, too heavy, too unmarried, and too poor to matter. They had thrown their broken iron at her feet and laughed when she picked it up. They had assumed that what they discarded had no value because they had decided she had no value, and to them the logic was circular and complete. But Abby had always known in the place where her father's voice still lived in her, that iron does not ask who discarded it. It does not apologize for being cracked or worn or left in the dirt. It waits for honest fire and patient hands, and the particular kind of courage that looks at a broken thing and sees not what it was, but what it could still become. She had not been saved by the town's approval. She had not been saved by Caleb Hart's love, though she intended to build something real and lasting with it. She had not been saved by $900, or a railroad letter, or a sheriff's investigation. She had saved herself with iron with fire, with the refusal to let anyone else's judgment be the last word on her worth. Everything that came after was not rescue. It was the life she had already earned.